Ezra Holding hadn't cried in 43 years. Not when his wife passed. Not when he lost the ranch's best stallion to colic. Not even when his son moved to California and stopped calling. Ezra had built a life on the Nebraska plains through grit and silence and tears. Weren't part of that equation until the morning he freed Rose from the flooded barn. What the mayor did in the moments after he pulled her to safety broke something open in Ezra's chest that he'd kept locked down for decades. It was a reaction so unexpected, so raw and honest that it reminded him of everything he'd forgotten about why he'd spent 47 years working with horses in the first place. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the spring storm that changed everything for an old rancher who thought he'd seen it all. 3 days before the flood, on a Tuesday morning, Ezra stood at his kitchen window, drinking bitter coffee and watching dark clouds build on the western horizon. March in Nebraska was unpredictable. You could get snow, tornado warnings, or 70 degrees sunshine, sometimes all in the same week. These clouds looked mean. His ranch sat in the Platte River Valley, 40 acres of pasture and cropland that had been in his family for 4 generations. The main barn was old, built by his grandfather in 1947. Solid post and beam construction that had weathered every storm Nebraska could throw at it. Or so Ezra had always thought. He pulled on his workcoat and headed out for morning chores. 6 horses lived on the property, now down from the 30 he'd kept in his prime. Age and practicality had whittled down the herd to just the ones he couldn't part with. Rose met him at her paddock gate, nickering her usual morning greeting. She was a chestnut quarter horse maymare, 15 years old, with a white blaze and 2 white socks on her hind legs. Ezra had bought her as a 3-year-old from a neighbor who was downsizing. She'd been his wife Clara's favorite. Clara had spent hours brushing her, braiding her mane, talking to her about everything and nothing. After Clara died 8 years ago, Ezra had almost sold Rose. Looking at the mayor hurt too much, reminded him too much of Saturday mornings watching Clara in the paddock laughing at something Rose had done, but he couldn't do it. Rose was the last piece of Clara he had left. "Morning, girl," Ezra said gruffly, scratching behind her ears the way she liked. "Storm coming. Big one by the looks of it." Rose pushed her nose into his chest and Ezra allowed himself a moment of softness before pulling away. He had 5 other horses to feed. By noon, the wind had picked up. By 3 o'clock, the National Weather Service issued a severe thunderstorm warning. By dinner time, they were predicting 4 to 6 in of rain. Ezra made sure all the horses had shelter access and went to bed early, listening to rain murmur against his farmhouse roof. The next morning, Ezra woke to the sound of thunder that shook the windows. He checked his phone. 4:47 a.m. Still dark outside. The rain was so heavy he could barely see his barn through the deluge. He dressed quickly and pulled on his waterproof coveralls and boots. The horses would be fine in their stalls and paddock shelters, but he wanted to check on them anyway. 47 years of ranching had taught him that fine could turn into crisis faster than you could saddle a horse. The barnyard was a mess of puddles and running water. The drainage ditches Ezra had dug years ago were overflowing, sending streams of muddy water across the gravel paths. Inside the barn, the horses were restless but safe. Ezra went down the line checking each one. Rose was in her usual stall, the third one on the left. She nickered when she saw him. "I know it's loud," Ezra said, "but you've been through worse." He checked the barn for leaks and found a few minor ones in the tack room, but nothing serious. The old building was holding up fine. By mid-morning, the rain hadn't let up. By afternoon, it was worse. The Weather Service upgraded their warnings and added flash flood watches for areas near the Platte River. Ezra's ranch was near the Platte River. He spent the day moving equipment to higher ground, securing anything that could float away and monitoring the water levels in the creek that ran through his property. The creek was already bank full and rising. That evening, his neighbor called. "Ezra, the river's at flood stage. If this rain keeps up through tomorrow, we're going to have problems. You might want to move your horses to higher ground." Ezra looked out at the downpour, moving 6 horses in this weather in the dark to where his highest pasture was already saturated. The horses were safer in the barn than anywhere else. "I'll keep an eye on it," he said. He stayed up until midnight, checking water levels with a flashlight, watching the creek continue to rise. Finally exhausted, he went to bed. That was his first mistake. Ezra jerked awake to the sound of his phone ringing. 5:15 a.m. His neighbor. Again, the levee broke upstream. "Water's coming. Get out if you can." Ezra was moving before he hung up. He threw on clothes, grabbed his boots, and ran outside into the pre-dawn darkness and pouring rain. What he saw made his stomach drop. Water was already spreading across his lower pasture, reflecting his porch light like a dark mirror, and it was moving fast, flowing toward the barn with purpose. No, Ezra ran. The barn sat on slightly higher ground than the pastures, but not by much. By the time Ezra reached it, water was already seeping under the doors. He hauled them open and waded inside. inside. The horses were panicking. The two nearest the door, his gelding and an older mare, were pacing their stalls, eyes white rimmed with fear. Water was already 6 in deep on the barn floor and rising visibly. Ezra moved fast. He opened the first stall, led the gelding out, and pointed him toward the open door. Go, get to high ground. The horse needed no encouragement. He splashed through the rising water and disappeared into the rain. Second stall. The older mare came willingly, and Ezra sent her after the gelding. Third stall. Rose. The mare was pressed into the back corner of her stall, trembling. The water was up to her knees now, and still rising. She'd always been afraid of water, even puddles. Clara used to joke that Rose was part cat. Come on, girl, we got to go. Ezra reached for her halter. Rose reared back, throwing her head up. She was too terrified to think straight. Rose. Ezra's voice was sharp. We don't have time for this. He managed to get the halter on her, but when he tried to lead her toward the stall door, she planted her feet and wouldn't budge. The water was rising around them both now, cold and murky. Ezra heard a crack from somewhere in the barn, the sound of timber shifting under pressure. He had to make a choice. 3 more horses were still in stalls further back. If he spent time fighting with Rose, he might not get to them. I'll come back, he promised, hating himself. I swear I'll come back for you. He closed Rose's stall door. At least it would keep her contained and safe from floating debris, and moved to the next horse. The 4th horse came easily. The 5th fought, but Ezra got him out. The 6th, his oldest mare, was already swimming in her stall when Ezra reached her. He had to wade through chest-deep water to get her halter on. By the time he got the 5th horse out of the barn, the water was up to his chest, and the current was getting stronger. The barn was flooding faster than he'd thought possible. Ezra stood in the doorway, water rushing around him, and looked back at Rose's stall. He couldn't see her. The water was too high, the morning light too dim. Another crack echoed through the barn, louder this time. The building was old. The water was undermining the foundation. If the barn collapsed, Ezra was 67 years old. He had a bad knee and a heart condition his doctor had been nagging him about for 3 years. If he went back in there and the building came down, nobody would find his body for days. He thought about Clara, about how much she'd love that mare, about Saturday mornings and braided manis, and the way his wife had laughed. Damn it. Ezra waded back into the flooded barn. The water was up to Ezra's shoulders now. He had to swim more than walk, pulling himself along the stall doors toward Rose's location. The current tried to push him sideways, and debris, loose boards, buckets, hay, bales bumped against him in the murky water. Rose, he shouted. Rose, where are you? He heard a splash and a terrified whinny from her stall. Ezra reached the stall door and hauled it open. The water inside was nearly 5 feet deep. Rose was swimming, her head barely above the surface, eyes rolling with panic. She'd been treading water, fighting to keep her head up. Easy, girl, easy. Ezra grabbed her halter. We're getting out of here. But Rose was beyond reasoning. She thrashed against him, nearly pushing him under. A hoof caught him in the ribs, and Ezra gasped, swallowing muddy water. He got his arm around her neck and held on. Rose, stop. You're going to drown us both. Another crack, this one right above them. Ezra looked up and saw a massive beam sagging in the ceiling. The barn was coming down. He did the only thing he could think of. He started singing. It was a song Clara used to sing to Rose, an old country ballad about a girl and her faithful horse. Ezra had heard it 1,000 times. Clara's voice floating across the paddock on summer evenings. His voice was rough, off-key, half drowned by water and rain, but he sang it anyway. Oh my Rose, my prairie. Rose, through the storms you've seen me through. Rose, stop thrashing. Through the cold and through the snows, I'll always come back to you. The mare's breathing slowed. She turned her head toward Ezra, her eye finding his in the dim light. That's my girl, Ezra whispered. Clara's girl. We're going home. He kept one hand on her halter and started pulling her toward the door, still humming the melody. Rose swam with him this time, not fighting, trusting him to lead her out. They were halfway to the barn door when the beam finally gave way. It crashed down into the water behind them, sending up a massive wave that pushed them both forward. Ezra lost his grip on Rose and went under, the current tumbling him like a washing machine. His head broke the surface and he gasped for air, searching frantically. Rose, he saw her ahead of him, swimming strongly now toward the pale rectangle of the barn door. She'd found her courage. Ezra swam after her, his bad knee screaming in protest, his lungs burning. They burst out of the barn together into the pouring rain and the gray morning light. The water outside was flowing fast, but not as deep. Ezra could touch bottom. He staggered toward higher ground, following Rose, who was already wading toward the one part of his property that stood above the flood, a small rise where his farmhouse sat. They climbed out of the water together, Rose scrambling up the muddy slope, Ezra crawling behind her on hands and knees. When they reached dry ground, Ezra collapsed on his back in the wet grass, coughing up river water and trying to breathe. He'd done it. They were both alive. Behind them, with with a groan that sounded almost human. The old barn surrendered to the flood. The walls buckled inward and the roof collapsed, sending up a wave that washed across the barnyard. Ezra watched his grandfather's barn disappear beneath the water and felt nothing but gratitude that they'd gotten out when they did. Ezra lay in the grass for a long time, too exhausted to move. The rain was finally lightning, turning from a downpour to a steady drizzle. Dawn was breaking properly now, revealing the full extent of the flood. His lower pastures were completely underwater. His barn was gone, and debris was scattered across everything, but his horses were alive. He could see them scattered across the higher ground, soaked and scared, but safe. Ezra started to sit up, his ribs protesting where Rose had kicked him. He needed to check on the other animals and needed to figure out what to do next. Rose walked over to him. She stopped a foot away, water streaming from her coat, her legs muddy to the shoulder, and looked at him with those dark, intelligent eyes. Then she folded her front legs and lay down beside him in the wet grass. Ezra froze. Horses didn't just lie down near people unless they were completely exhausted or completely trusting. Rose wasn't exhausted. She'd climbed that hill with energy to spare. She was choosing to be vulnerable near him, choosing to rest beside him, but it was what she did next that broke him. Rose stretched out her neck and gently rested her head in Ezra's lap. It was a gesture Clara had taught her years ago. Clara would sit in the pasture reading, and Rose would come over and put her head in Clara's lap, and they'd stay that way for hours while Clara read aloud and stroked the mayor's face. Ezra hadn't seen Rose do it since Clara died. He'd assumed the mayor had forgotten that the behavior had died with his wife, but Rose remembered. She lay there with her head in Ezra's lap, breathing softly, trusting him completely. And Ezra understood what she was saying. "Thank you. I trust you. You came back for me like you promised." Something in Ezra's chest cracked open. All the grief he'd been holding back for 8 years, all the loneliness, all the pain of losing Clara and then shutting himself off from feeling anything at all. It came pouring out. He put his hand on Rose's wet neck and cried. He cried for Clara, who'd loved this horse so much. He cried for the years he'd wasted being hard and closed off. He cried for almost losing Rose because he'd been too slow to react. He cried because this horse, this beautiful creature, still remembered kindness and love even after everything. And he cried because Rose had waited 8 years to show him that some bonds don't break just because someone dies. That Clara's love was still alive in this mare, in the way she'd learned to trust and rest her head in someone's lap. Rose didn't move. She just lay there with him, patient and calm, while an old rancher finally let himself grieve. By noon, the rain had stopped. By early afternoon, neighbors started arriving with boats and trucks, checking on everyone in the flood zone. They found Ezra in his barn lot building a temporary shelter for his horses using salvaged lumber and tarps. Rose stood nearby, never more than a few feet from him, like a dog guarding its owner. "Ezra, you okay? We heard the barn went down." "I'm fine. Got all the horses out." Ezra hammered another support post into the ground. "You should evacuate. Water might rise again." "Can't evacuate 6 horses. We'll manage." His neighbors knew better than to argue. Instead, they helped. By evening, there was a decent 3-sided shelter set up on the high ground. Someone brought hay that hadn't gotten wet. Someone else brought grain. A woman from the next ranch over brought hot coffee and sandwiches. "That mayor hasn't left your side all day," she observed, watching Rose follow Ezra back and forth as he worked. "She had a rough morning." Ezra said. "Heard you went back and forth." Heard the barn was coming down." Ezra didn't respond. That was a foolish thing to do. Ezra probably Clara would have been proud. Ezra's hands stopped moving. He looked at the woman, Linda, who'd been Clara's friend, who'd brought casseroles for months after the funeral. "She loved that horse," he said quietly. "She loved you, too. And she'd want you to be safe." "I know, but I couldn't." Ezra's voice caught. "I couldn't let Rose go like that. Clara trusted me to take care of her." Linda nodded. "Well, you did, and from the looks of it, that horse knows exactly what you did for her." The flood water receded over the next 3 days, leaving behind a mess of mud, debris, and destruction. Ezra's barn was a total loss, just a pile of broken timber and twisted metal where a solid building had stood for 77 years. His insurance adjuster came out and shook his head. "I'm sorry, Ezra. The policy will cover some of it, but building a new barn is going to cost more than you'll get." Ezra had expected that. He was too old to take on debt, too old to rebuild. He'd figure something out. What he hadn't expected was Rose. The mayor wouldn't leave his side. When he worked on clearing debris, she followed him. When he sat down to rest, she stood beside him. At night, when he put the horses in the temporary shelter, Rose would whinny whenever Ezra walked back to his house, anxious until she saw him return in the morning. "She thinks if she stops watching you, you might disappear," the veterinarian said when she came to check on the horses a week after the flood. "Horses bond intensely with people who saved their lives. She knows what you did for her. She's just being clingy because of the trauma." "No, Ezra, this is different. The vet gestured to where Rose stood by the fence, her eyes tracking Ezra's every movement. She's chosen you. Really chosen you. Before, she was your horse because you owned her. Now she's your horse because she wants to be. Ezra didn't know what to say to that. The story of Ezra going back into a collapsing barn to save his wife's horse spread through the county. People Ezra hadn't talked to in years started stopping by, not to gossip, but to help. Someone donated lumber. Someone else brought tools. A group of men from a church 3 towns over showed up one Saturday and spent the entire day clearing the barn site. We heard what you did, their leader said. Figured we could do something for you in return. Ezra didn't cry this time, but it was close. By the end of March, there was enough salvaged and donated material to build a small barn, nothing like his grandfather's massive structure, but enough for 6 horses and a tack room. Ezra worked on it every day, and Rose supervised every day, standing nearby and watching. When he took breaks, she'd walk over and rest her head against his shoulder. It was during one of these breaks that Ezra finally understood what Rose's reaction that morning had really meant. She hadn't just been saying thank you, she'd been showing him that trust and love could survive loss, that Clara wasn't gone as long as Ezra could still remember how to care about something beyond himself. Rose had been waiting 8 years for Ezra to wake up, to stop just going through the motions of life and actually live it again. And it took a flood and a near-death experience for him to finally understand. 2 months later and the new barn was finished. Small, efficient, and built to withstand Nebraska weather. Ezra stood back and looked at it with satisfaction. It wasn't his grandfather's barn, but it was his, built with his hands and the help of neighbors he'd forgotten he had. Rose had the first stall right by the door. She walked into it like she owned the place and immediately stuck her head out to watch Ezra work. Comfortable? Ezra asked. Rose nickered. Ezra walked over and scratched behind her ears. You know, before the flood, I was just existing, getting through each day. Didn't even realize how much of me had shut down after Clara died. The mayor leaned into his touch. But you remembered. You remembered what Clara taught you about trust and kindness. And you showed me that I'd forgotten. Ezra pulled a folded photograph from his pocket. Clara sitting in the pasture with Rose, both of them looking at the camera, both of them happy. He'd found it in a box while cleaning up after the flood. I think Clara would have been okay with what happened, he said quietly. She'd probably say I was an idiot for going back into a collapsing barn, but she'd understand why I did. Rose shifted her head and rested it against Ezra's chest, just like she'd done that morning in the wet grass. Yeah, Ezra said, his throat tight. I understand, too. Ezra is 68 now. Rose is 16. They've been inseparable for over a year since that March morning when a flood forced an old rancher to remember what mattered most. The small barn works perfectly for his scale-down operation. The insurance money and community donations made it possible. But more than that, the experience of rebuilding taught Ezra something he'd forgotten. Accepting help isn't weakness. Community isn't something you only take from, it's something you give to. Now, Ezra helps other ranchers when they're in trouble. He's the first one to show up with tools, or hay, or just an extra pair of hands. People joke that the flood turned him into a different person. It didn't, though. It just reminded him of who he used to be. Rose still follows him everywhere. She's earned the right to be spoiled. Extra grain, the best pasture, and Ezra sitting in her stall every evening reading aloud just like Clary used to do. You're turning into an old softy, one of his neighbors teased last week. Maybe, Ezra admitted, but I'm okay with that because here's what that morning in the flood taught him. Life isn't about being tough enough to not feel anything. It's about being brave enough to feel everything. The grief and the joy, the fear and the love, the pain and the connection. Rose's reaction, lying down beside him, putting her head in his lap, showing him that trust and love could survive anything, had cracked open something in Ezra that needed to break. It reminded him that vulnerability isn't weakness, that crying isn't failure, that loving something enough to risk everything for it is what makes life worth living. Saturday, Ezra sat in Rose's stall, reading. It was a warm spring evening, and the mayor stood with her head resting in his lap, exactly like she used to do with Clara. And Ezra thought about how close he'd come to losing this, not just the horse, but the feeling, the connection, the reminder that he was still capable of loving. Something. Thank you, girl, he whispered, scratching behind her ears. For reminding an old fool what matters. Rose sighed contentedly and closed her eyes. Some people thought Ezra cried that day because he was overwhelmed or traumatized or just exhausted from the rescue. They were wrong. Ezra cried because Rose showed him that 8 years of shutting himself off from feeling hadn't erased his capacity to love. It had just buried it. And in one perfect moment of trust and connection, a horse had dug it back up and reminded him that life, real life, not just existence, was still possible. That's worth crying over. That's worth everything. Thank you for spending this time with me, with Ezra, and with Rose. If this story touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This channel is built on stories that celebrate the incredible bond between horses and humans. Stories about trust, redemption, and the ways animals teach us to be better people. Share this video with someone who loves horses or someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to open your heart again. Sometimes we need a flood, literal or metaphorical, to wake us up and show us what really matters. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had a horse change your life? Have you ever experienced a moment with an animal that broke through your walls and made you feel again? I read every single comment, and your stories matter. Until next time, stay open, stay brave, and remember that sometimes the most important thing we can do is cry when we need to. See you in the next story. Take care of yourselves and your animals.